What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. So if you've been tracking the channel, then you'll know that I've recently been looking ahead into next season for a lot of teams, particularly in the SEC, and talking about their futures and specifically how I think they'll do next year as of right now. So I figured it was time to talk about the juggernaut of college football, the Alabama Crimson Tide, and why if you think they're going anywhere anytime soon, you're dead wrong. So let's begin with how Bama did last year. They won the SEC West, won the SEC Championship, and then ultimately lost in a rematch against Georgia in the national title game. So for most teams, that would be an outstanding year, but for Bama fans, anything other than winning the big game has become a down year of sorts, which just speaks to the greatness of Nick Saban and the Bama program. Bryce Young won the Heisman in his first year as a starter, and the only guy who had a legitimate argument against Young to win the Heisman instead of him was also on their team in Will Anderson Jr., so they clearly had no shortage of standout players. That doesn't even mention guys like Jamison Williams and John Mechie or Brian Robinson or anybody else on the defense. There's so many guys I could talk about from that last year Alabama team that you get the point, okay? However, if you're somebody who followed that team more closely last year, then there were a lot more ups and downs than usual for an Alabama team of recent years. The regular season loss to Texas A&M was a big wake-up call and an example of a lot of the issues and struggles that the entire team had. They were very inconsistent throughout the season until the postseason, and then in some games against like Mississippi State and Ole Miss, they would absolutely dominate. They looked the part. They looked like the Alabama we expected. And then in other games against Arkansas or Auburn, they would just struggle incredibly poorly against inferior teams, like in Auburn in particular. And this was probably the youngest and most vulnerable Alabama team that Saban has had in years. And yet they still made it to the national title game and lost in a pretty close fashion right up until the very last plays to a historically good Georgia team. And the dominance on display from this program, it's absolutely crazy at that point when your down year, your most inexperienced and vulnerable roster makes the national championship and plays a very good game and wins their conference, wins the toughest conference in the country. It's crazy. So with all that being said about last season, though, what does that mean about this upcoming season? Well, it should be obvious that if I just said that this Bama team last year was about as young and vulnerable as Saban has ever had, then his team next season should return an immense amount of talent and experience, and boy, do they. Bryce Young and Will Anderson both return, so Bama will have the best offensive player in the country back and the best defensive player in the country back. That's a huge thing to be able to say. You can't really argue with either one of them either. It's not like Bryce Young is barely the best offensive player or Will Anderson is barely the best defensive player. They are far and away and clearly the two best players in the country. And that is just an insane thing to be able to claim and say for your team. And you add on to that another elite recruiting class for Alabama in this upcoming cycle that we just had finished up with signing day, not to mention what they're doing in the transfer portal with additions of players like Jermaine Burden and Elias Ricks, and I'm sure a few more yet to come as things shake out after spring practices heading into summer. The running back room is always stacked at Alabama, and it was going to be once again next year, but just in case you weren't convinced, they went out and added Jahmyr Gibbs, the running back transfer out of Georgia Tech, and he is absolutely outstanding. People may not appreciate just how good he is because of him coming from a school like Georgia Tech, but I assure you he is very, very good. And now that he'll be surrounded by better talent and better coaching at Alabama, I'm sure he's only going to get better. And yes, they did recently lose Kamar Wheaton into the transfer portal, but I don't think that's that big of a deal. Yes, it's a 5-star running back. It's always a big deal. But Bama has so much depth at the running back spot that they will be just fine. I mean, last year they were going to have a ridiculous running back room, but then most all of them got hurt, so that kind of came down to just Brian Robinson and Trey Sanders. Next year is going to be a lot better running back room, I think, overall for them. I could go all the way down the Bama roster, talk about each and every position group, but it would just essentially be me saying the same things over and over again, just raving about how deep and how talented they are at literally every single position. So instead of doing that, I'd like to compare Bama to the rest of their competition next year in order to explain exactly why I don't think they are going to go anywhere, why they fully expect them to be back in the SEC title and likely in the playoff once again next year. So let's just go over Bama's schedule now and look at what teams might give them trouble and compare them to the rest of the conference. A quick reminder before we start going through all of that I have made multiple videos on the channel at this point about how I am very high on multiple teams in the SEC West already, and that's because I do genuinely feel like the SEC West just keeps getting better and better, and I am very excited about those teams I've talked about. But Alabama is so loaded next season that I don't know if it's really going to matter in the long run once we look at this schedule. So let's get into it. Bama begins with Utah State, so that's a guaranteed win. No need to say anything else there. Then they are at Texas in a big-time Week 2 matchup. Now, Texas is going to be very overmatched here, just as far as a roster perspective goes, but they are good enough to make it competitive, particularly early when they have their home crowd behind them, especially with all the hype that they have around that program in year 2 under Steve Sarkisian. They've added Quinn Ewers as their new quarterback of the future. Bijan Robinson returns. Xavier Worthy returns. It's going to be a very good Texas team. But ultimately, Bryce Young and the rest of Bama will likely dominate as the game wanes on. Bama is a deeper, better, more talented team. They're a more experienced team at this point. I think they're going to win in a pretty convincing fashion in that sense. And even if they do struggle some along the way, it's going to be very difficult for Texas to actually pull off the upset and beat Bama. I think they're still a little ways away, maybe a year or two away under Sarkisian before they can really expect to compete at that level. Alabama is especially, they're going to show up with their A game. This is their first real test of the season. They know what happened last season with their inconsistencies and taking some teams more lightly than they should have. And you know that you're going to get their A game. It's a big-time matchup. They're not going to overlook Texas, and you're not going to catch them sleeping. And with that all being said, I just don't think Texas has a real good shot at winning. Now, they could win. They're a good enough team to win this game, but it seems unlikely. Then they play UL Monroe and Vandy, who are two more guaranteed wins for Bama at this point. After that, there is another very interesting game, which is at Arkansas. And now Arkansas is one of those teams I was talking about that I am very, very high on heading into next season. But I just don't expect them to be able to beat Bama yet. I expect this game to be very, very close. I could see it as one of the most, if not the very most losable game for Alabama next year, being that it comes right after the Texas game. It's at Arkansas. It's early in the season, so Arkansas will still be very fresh. Their depth issues won't be quite as apparent yet. And I do think Arkansas is a legitimate contender next season as far as just chances to have like a 10-win season. I'm not saying they're a playoff contender, but they're a very, very good team next year. They're going to be a very, very dangerous team. And that's a very losable game for Bama, but Bama is still the better team with the better quarterback, the better coaching staff, and I just don't think that Bama's going to lose here. I think Bama could win by 2 scores if they really play their A game here. So, I don't know. Still leaning Bama on that game, although I do think it is one of the most losable games of the season. And then it gets even more interesting, though. The very next week, they host Texas A&M, which is the team that upset them last year. And Texas A&M looks to be even better next season with a lot, and I mean a lot, of young freshman talent to play with. They just signed the highest-rated recruiting class in the history of recruiting classes, so that is big, but they're all going to be freshmen. And last year's Alabama team wasn't as good as I think this one is going to be. Like I said, they had huge inconsistency problems, and when they lost to A&M, they were on the road, and Kyle Field is a very difficult place to play in, especially on the road at night, and it still took special teams touchdowns and other improbable events and situations to go perfectly for A&M for them to come out on top in a very close matchup. With this year's Bama team probably being even better, being a lot more experienced, this being a home game for Alabama, and there's a revenge factor on Alabama's side, I think Bama wins another big game here. Although, again, similar to Arkansas, it is still losable, but I honestly give Arkansas a better shot at winning just because I think Bama is going to lock in on this Texas A&M game because of what happened last year. Then Bama travels to face Tennessee in Neyland Stadium, and Tennessee is a team that could cause some problems next year for a lot of people, and with this being on the road for Bama, it's coming off of back-to-back very tough games against back-to-back tough games against Arkansas and Texas A&M. Tennessee has a chance to pull off the upset here. However, I don't actually think that they're going to. There's still way too big of a talent gap between these two programs that Tennessee would need everything to go their way. Them to play a perfect game, Bama to play a B game and things, bounce of ball plays, little weird, obscure things that happen in college football, those also all need to go their way for them to even have a shot at winning this game. And I think Bama rolls again in the long run there. I don't think Tennessee can hang around just yet, but it will be an interesting game to watch. Mississippi State is not a guaranteed win. They're next up, but it's pretty close to being a guaranteed win, especially being at home. I think Bama wins by 3+ scores there. They're the much better team. Then they get their bye week before playing at LSU in Death Valley, and that game is always crazy. And this one is especially hard for me to give an accurate prediction on because if you've seen my video on LSU at this point, you know that I see them as the biggest wild card in the SEC next season. They could be a 6-win team or a 10-win team. I expect them to be somewhere around 8 or 9 wins, probably just kind of pick in the middle of those two extremes. But it's just really difficult to really know because LSU has so many unknowns, and it's always a very, very tough game to win, especially at LSU at night. But Bama, I think, is a little bit ahead of LSU at this point. Brian Kelly's in year 1. Nick Saban's been there way longer. Nick Saban is the best coach of all time. Alabama's going to have the better quarterback. Alabama has the better talent overall. They're the better team. I think they win here as well, but it is another potentially losable game on the schedule. And then they follow that game up with another interesting game to me, and that is at Ole Miss. And I'm very high on Ole Miss next season as well, but ultimately I just don't think Ole Miss will be good enough to pull out the upset next year. But being at home plus having Lane Kiffin gives them a real shot. I think Ole Miss could be just as good as they were this past year, or even better potentially. The thing is going to be how good is Jackson Dart. But, they're going to have a true freshman quarterback, I just mentioned, in Jackson Dart, starting against Alabama. Bama is the much, much deeper, much more talented team. And I just don't think that it's a wise decision to pick an Ole Miss upset at this point in the offseason, heading into next year. You just can't say that you expect Ole Miss to beat Alabama. I'm not saying that they won't. It is a losable game for Bama, especially being on the road, but it's just not likely. And then that leaves Austin Peay, which is a guaranteed win, and Auburn. And while Auburn is always scary because it's the Iron Bowl, crazy things always happen in the Iron Bowl, Bama has them at home, and I think Auburn could end up being the worst team in the SEC West next season. So I think Bama wins that game pretty handedly, and that would have them at undefeated once again if everything played out this way. And again, this isn't my actual season prediction. It's just a look ahead very early on for now as a general topic of who I think would be most likely to win. It's not an actual prediction. I will do predictions for every team later on into the offseason as we get closer to next year. But for now, I just don't see a team that's going to be better than Alabama on their schedule that you could say has a better than 50% chance or even a better than 40% chance to beat Alabama most likely next season. Bama is going to be very, very difficult to beat next year. Now, they do have losable games on their schedule like the Texas game, Arkansas, Tennessee, A&M, Ole Miss, maybe even Auburn, but all of those games would take a lot of external factors all just aligning perfectly for Bama to lose. Texas A&M, Arkansas, Ole Miss, and LSU are the only ones of that group that I think even have a remote shot at being nearly as good as Bama next season as a team. And even those 4 are doubtful to be that good. Of them, maybe 1 or 2 will actually achieve at that level. It's going to be very difficult to actually pull that off. And even if they do lose and drop one of those games, whoever beats them can only lose one conference game themselves if they want to prevent Alabama from making the SEC championship. And as of right now, I just don't see any team being good enough to both beat Alabama in the upset and basically win out against every other team in the conference except for the one. And that's what it's going to take to keep Alabama out of the SEC championship game, and I just don't see it happening. To me, in all likelihood, Bama will be right back in the SEC title again next year. And they will most likely be favored in that game too. Obviously, it's way too early to say all of that for sure, but that seems like the likely scenario. I don't think people really understand just how much Saban and Bama overcame last season and how many things didn't go their way, and they still only lost once during the regular season and made the national title. Next year's team will be even better and more experienced at almost every position. They most likely won't suffer nearly as many injuries as last year's team did throughout the entirety of the season. not just at the very end, the receiver injuries that everybody wants to talk about. Bama was very injured the whole season. They're going to have an even better version of Bryce Young and Will Anderson, both leading the team who have both learned a lot from last season. Basically, what I'm saying is Alabama isn't going anywhere, especially not next season, just purely based off of roster talent alone. Not even mentioning having the GOAT, Nick Saban, back again to keep coaching them up. Anybody doubting Alabama at this point, especially based off of last season, will be sorely disappointed when next year rolls around and they are just as dominant as usual. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. Let me know down below what you guys think about Alabama next season and if you think they will get back to the SEC title game and beyond once more. Also, if you made it this far in the video, go ahead and leave a like because it helps out the channel tremendously. And subscribe for more college football content in the future because I will continue to upload college football content very regularly going forward. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.